Okay, we are in Pirkei Avot, and we're in chapter two, taking our very slow move through Pirkei Avot, chapter two. And I think in the Safaria, if you're using the one online, we are um, on Mishnah 8 because the way that they kind of the way that each there are different numberings of the Mishnahs. So that's 8. And in the one I'm using, it's actually 12. And I actually kind of like what this one did in dividing it up into oh, I got people coming in. Hold on. Hold on. Okay. In dividing it up into two Mishnahs, I really like it because it creates a sense of tension between these two. Because if you remember the last Mishnah. In the last Mishnah, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai was comparing. Actually, there's three Mishnahs which sometimes are taken as one. So Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai was rabbi of the first century, um, CE. Um, was comparing his students. Okay, he was comparing his students. Never should do that. It's not really a good thing to do. Okay, but we used to do it in the teacher's lounge all the time. But it's a bad thing to do. But we used to do it anyway. So he says. Um, Rabbi Eliezer ben Hyrcanus, he's a plastered well, never loses a drop, right? This is a guy who he remembers everything you teach him. He just kind of holds on to it. Shua ben Chananya, he says, happy as the one who gave him birth. He's a really good guy, right? And actually, I think one commentary says he was very good looking, right? He was a powerful figure of a man, as they would say in the 19th century. Um, and then Yosei HaKohen, he says he was a pious man, a chassid, a person who went above and beyond the law. And Rabbi Shimon ben Netanel, a person who feared sin, a person who was very cautious. And finally, Elazar ben Arach, he's an he's a Mayan Hamid Gaber. He's an ever-flowing spring. He's an ever-flowing spring. Now. The next Mishnah says, Huaya Omer used to say, Im yu kol chachmei Yisrael b'kach me'amaznaim. If you took all of the sages of Israel and you put them on one side of the scale, right? So imagine this giant scale, right? And you put all of the sages of Israel on one side of the scale. Ve'elezer ben Horkanas b'chav shniah machrian kulam, and you put Elizabeth Horkenes, right? If you put him on the on the other, he would outweigh them all, right? He would outweigh the all. He would outweigh them all. Okay, so that's remember Elazar ben Horkenes. He was the one who was a cistern that doesn't lose a drop of water. Okay, so that was one opinion. However, so he was heard to say that. Okay, he was heard to say that. But he says, Abba Shaul Omer Mishmo, but Abba Shaul said in his name. Okay, so now we have a conflict. Right? Which did he say? He says, Im yu kol chachmei Yisrael b'chaf moznaim, if you took all of the sages of Israel and you put them on one side of the scale, but Elezer ben Arach b'chaf shnia, and you took Elezer ben Arach and you put him on the other side, he would outweigh them all. So the one who is like a flowing spring, the one who's like an ever-growing spring, he's the one who would outweigh them all. So it's interesting. There are two versions of what he favored,
Meeting.
right? So one way of understanding he said, you know, I think that the best thing is for a person to be able to take in a lot of information, to hold on to the information, right? That's the person who does really well on multiple choice tests. Okay, they do really well on multiple choice tests. okay? Because they can take in all the information, they can download it onto the paper, right? Just perfectly. And that's definitely a skill. And then, but Abba Shul heard him to say, no, 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 it's not that. It's the person who is the ever flowing spring. Now, in general, just just to say, like in the code of Jewish law, it says yesh omrim v'yesh omrim. Some people say and some people say. We always go with the second one, right? We always go with the second one. So I think the intention here may be to say that really it's Elazar ben right ben Arach. It's really the person who is like the overflowing spring, the one who's constantly innovating, the person who's coming up with new things and who's watering the world with his Torah, right? And that's the person who's favored. But really, both of these are skills. And they're both important to Torah study, to be able to retain information, but also, to be able to use it in a creative way. Um, so what do you think about this? Which one would you weigh? Which is more important to you, retaining information or the way that you use information?
Well, naturally, the way that you use information so that you can, that's innovation, we have to, well, why would we just regurgitate if we can kind of push the envelope a little even, so it's very important stuff. Yeah, of course. I,
Well, so I'll push back for a second. So
yeah,
maybe that's a modern kind of view.
yeah,
If
I guess that's a little modern, yeah.
if I'm kind of like if my job is to be a transmitter of tradition, right? If my job is to be a transmitter of tradition, then maybe the best thing for me is to be able to take in the information and to be able to give over the information exactly as I learned it.
Especially in a world where there wasn't any where you didn't have written books.
Right. When you have an oral tradition,
When you're when you have a when you have uh when things are written down and reproduced, right? So you have that base of knowledge, then you can be creative with it. But in a world in which having things, the only transmission is through memory,
right,
right? I think really the truth is that they're both valuable, but
right,
they're valuable for, but they're complementary skills. You need the guy who's the griot who can just
right,
spill out, and then you need the guy who can say, okay, so now what do we learn from this?
right. I think that's a very good point. That you really both of them, and it's possible that Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai kind of maybe made both those comments at different times. Maybe at one time he was just sort of amazed at this guy's ability to transmit the tradition because he had just sort of taken it in whole. Um, but also another thing I thought of is whether or not um, this changes, in the information era. Like you said, okay, if you don't have books, if you don't have, you know, increasingly in education, for example, right? One of the things that we're realizing, I just saw this the other day. Somebody was talking about yeshiva, right? They're talking about yeshiva education. And he said, students are not coming to me anymore for information, right? It used to be that people were coming so that they had access to information, right? Because only the rabbis had access to that information. Right. So the Talmud was impossible to understand without a teacher to help you understand it. But now, right, you have lots of helps, right? You have translations where they fill in you have translations in English and in Hebrew and in pretty much any language you can imagine that fill in the gaps for you. You have all the Daf Yomi forums that has questions and charts, and you can take classes online from any one of a million teachers that you want to. So information is all available, and then if you don't need to go to the yeshiva for a library because most of what you would want is in your phone, right? Or on your computer and available to you. So maybe the age of Elazar ben Hyrcanus, right? The age of the person who is the repository of knowledge is 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 over to some extent, right? Is over to some extent, and now it's the person who can be creative. Yeah, Leonard,
Larry, Larry,
Sorry.
Larry. No problem. I'm going to push back against that just to keep the whole debate thing going, and say that what's important about the plastered well is that he contains the entirety of the knowledge. It is very easy for me if I have a specific halachic question or I'm interested in an issue to go out and read very narrowly on on the topic and perhaps try to formulate my own opinions. Those opinions, though, from my ever springing well, are going to be limited because I can't and don't know everything. I think that there's a role for the synthesis for somebody who before. In art, we were told that if you want to be, a groundbreaking artist, the first thing you have to do is master whatever the standards of your art are, because it's only once you understand, what's going on that you can intelligently break the rules. And I think that applies to Piskei Halacha as much as it does to art.
Yeah, that's by the way, that's exactly what Frank Zappa said. Somebody once asked Frank Zappa, um, you know, how it's possible that a person who went to Juilliard could make such weird music. And he said only a person who went to Juilliard could make such weird music.
And I
Because,
have to amend myself. I meant like, yes, I thought the question was as long as we have the foundation, that's a pretty strong foundation, then we can, right, not to
okay,
align myself with Frank Zappa.
Caleb is amended. Megan?
So I just want to push back against the idea that like in a true oral culture, which I mean, from what I understand, like people could write and when they were putting this stuff down, and there was some, you know, there were the tablets or there were something that was kind of, not just in one person's mouth and into the other person's ear. Like if you look at like the Homeric, legends or Greek myths, there's like 500 versions of all of them or like Native American folk tales. I think that we are, we're likely to kind of like lionize this person that like doesn't let a drop spill, and we kind of overemphasize like how like nothing changed, when in reality an oral culture is by nature kind of flexible, because the griot decides like which of the folk tales he's going to pull out for this particular circumstance and kind of interpret them according to the current nuance. Whereas if you have this like it shall be this way for all time and in all places, and this is the way, um, you might not have so much contextualization of what the original things were, kind of building off what Larry was saying, that if you read the two lines about, homosexuality and, say Christian scripture, and you ignore the whole rest of the thing or the social context, you might come up with a very different perspective than somebody who knows the whole thing and knows the historical and, that
Right.
whole business. So yeah, I'm kind of skeptical about like people who hold every drop and who, transmit it. And the other thing is that I think that the transmitter, like your conduct and your righteousness are the message. Because like there's a reason why you pick one teacher over another, even if they're both teaching, French 101 or something that's like kind of mechanical, because it's not just the information, it's their way of being that they transmit. And like I probably am more likely to be in the jihadi Jew Pirkei Avot than in go to a yesh. I probably wouldn't go to a yeshiva, to be honest at this point. Like, you
This is
know,
a push point in your career, although,
yeah,
you never know what can happen.
we
Uh,
never know.
yeah. So I think you're okay, so two things. One is you just anticipated exactly where Pirkei Avot is going next, because and maybe it's answering a question that I never thought of. Because you're right. This is so far we've been talking about intellectual qualities, and now it's going to switch and it's going to talk about moral qualities. And it's going to be talking about who these guys are and what they think is the most important thing in life. So that's interesting, right? So we start out with this intellectual, and it's almost like somebody in the class asked your question, right? And said, "Well, okay, that's very nice. Thank you for telling me about their intellectual styles, but like, who are these guys, and what do they think is most, important in life?" The second thing is, when it comes to transmission of oral traditions, it's a very mixed bag, honestly. Um, because there is a certain amount of creativity involved in it, right? There is a certain amount of creativity involved in it. And then there's also, um, you know, I well, it's a long story, but I remember in India watching Brahmin boys learn Vedas, right? And like if they made a mistake, like they got hit. They got hit. And and there were lots of things put into place to make sure they didn't make mistakes, aside from the stick. The stick was one of them, but also like their bodies had to move a certain way, their head had to move a certain way. There are lots of things in place to kind of make sure they kind of got it, and a lot of testing. So there are some traditions which kind of do that. And interesting, I mean, this Mishnah here, this seems pretty clear from the way the language of the Mishnah is the simplicity of the language of the Mishnah seems to be designed for people to memorize it, which is which is interesting. And Mishnah itself can mean repetition, right? To repeat
Oh,
something.
thanks, Matt.
So, uh, Lainey, you've got your hand up.
Yeah, okay, I got two literary references for you. One is Fahrenheit 451, where books are being burned and other people take it upon themselves to memorize
Oh,
books
oh
and
yeah,
then pass
yeah,
the
yeah,
transmission on. The
yeah.
other and contrasting one is 1984, where Orwell says that because nothing is written down in a hard and fast way, narrative, and after a while, people accept the new narrative because they have nothing to fact check it against.
Hmm.
So those are my two.
I feel like 1984 is. I think that's coming on us. I think that's coming on us. Linda, up you have to.
One of the things that concerns me as a philologist is the instability of the written text
Mm-hmm,
and trying to, for example, something as simple as vocalization,
mm-hmm,
which isn't simple at all. And depending upon, or the semantic shifts that occur in language, a word means something at one specific period, 200 years later,
mm-hmm.
it means something quite differently. So there is always a need for people who are focused on the text and on its meaning. Now, the text and the meaning will shift throughout time. That's almost inevitable. You can't read without interpretation. But you have to have an interpretation before you can even hope to act upon the text. So I would suggest respectfully that the opposition that you set up in the beginning between the person who applies the teaching of the text and the person who is focused on preserving and transmitting the text, it's a false opposition. The two fit together like a hand and a glove.
Yeah. Well, he said, well, it's
Which reminds me of
right. The Mishnah kind of puts it in that kind of says to us, hey, look, this guy has this incredible talent, and look, he's more important than everybody else. This guy's incredible talent, he's more important than anybody else. But yes, you're right. I think that they do kind of go together. Um, okay, so let's find out about uh, those sort of moral qualities. So he says, Amar lahem. So he said to them. So now he's talking to he's talking to his students, right? This is kind of like a classroom exercise, right? They've walked into the classroom, and he says, "Tz'uru eza hiderech tova sheyidbak ba adam." Says see, go and see which is the right way to which one should cling. Right? What's the way that a person should cling to a derech tova, the good way that a person should cling to? What's the what's the way? So Rabbi Eliezer Omer. So Rabbi Eliezer says, ayin tova, having a good eye, having a good eye. Um, Meaning not being jealous of other people, giving people the benefit of the doubt, um, seeing the good in other people. There of course, this is also, you know, this is this is the Middle East. This is the Middle East, and the idea of the ayin hara, the evil eye, right? Is a very big part of culture. It's mentioned all over the place that that envy has an incredible power, right? That a person's envy can have power over others and can cause damage to other people. So an Ain Tova is the opposite of that. Is to have a good eye as opposed to a bad eye, as they say in Italian, malocchio. I grew up with Italians, and they, you know, they they would my friend's grandmother used to spit and go malocchio, malocchio, whatever anybody would, and he'd bring home he'd brag about a test that he did or something like that. She go, malocchio. So okay. Rabbi Eliezer Omer and my family, it's Kanai Nahara. That was whenever anybody said something good, to say Kanahera. It always said like Kinahera, Kanahara. May there be no evil eye. So Rabbi Yeshua Omer, Chaver Tov, to have a good companion, says a way to have a good life, right? The derech tov, a good way is to have a good companion. Chaver Tov. A chaver in this case probably means not just it means a good companion. Chaver often means also a learning partner. It means somebody who is close to you in in learning and in life. It's friendship, but it's a friendship kind of based on common values and on learning together. Um, uh, Rabbi Yosef Omer says, "Shachen tov," a good neighbor. Right, best thing to have is a good neighbor. So having a good environment, right? Having a good environment. It's important to be in a good environment, to be around people who are good. Reb Shimon Omer, haroed hanolad, a person should see, really, who sees the beginning of the thing. Sees the beginning of the thing means sees considers the consequences of things, is able to predict what's coming up from what it is that you see happening around you, right? Somebody who's able to understand the consequences of things, who's able to kind of look ahead look ahead at what's coming. And then lastly, Rabbi Elazar says, to lev tov, a good heart, a good heart. So he says, Levtov. So Amar Lahem. So he said to them, he says, Ro'ani et divrei Elazar ben Arach midivrechem shebeklal dvarav divreche. He says, if you're asking me, he says, me, the way I see it, the words of Elazar ben Arach, the last word, Lev Tov, he says, I prefer his words because they include because they include all of the rest of yours. Right? He says, so a Lev Tov, if a person has a good heart, then they're going to have all these other things. Right? The person who has a person has a person who has a good heart, whatever that means. Your heart, of course, is not, you know, the heart is the core, right? It's the core of the human being, right? When we say, I love you with all my heart, we don't mean we really don't love with our heart, we love with our brain, but we would never say, oh, I love you with all of my brain, right? Because it's not what we mean. We mean that we love with the core of our, with the core of our being. Um,
But
and so
but wasn't it the case that at this time heart was seen more as the seat of the intellect than the seat of the emotions?
Well, yes, and I think it's the yes, the emotions. We had this discussion yesterday. Yesterday we were talking about klayot. We're talking about kidneys, right? So yes, it's true that kind of the heart was sort of the seat of decision making, rationality, and emotions were sort of situated in different parts of the body in the kidneys and the liver and the spleen and the kind of like the offal, the organ meats were full of emotions. But yeah, I think so, but I think it's a little deeper than that. I don't think it means heart, as you say. I mean, we usually use heart to mean emotions, but heart definitely is used in many, many places to mean intellect or mind. Very often there's no way to translate the word heart except by translating as mind, right? That there's some places where there's just no other way to do that. So it can also really mean mind. So person has a good mind, but not in the sense of kind of like the ability to do, intellectual exercises. It's not, but the ability to make good moral to make good moral decisions. Um, I think. I have to think about it. Honestly, I have to think about it. Um, anybody have an idea what a good heart is?
Well, I'm just in relation to kind of what we're talking about kind of just transmitting the text and being kind of and sticking with the actual truth of the text versus what you do with the knowledge. I'm kind of having a link there. And so the good heart I imagine would be, I mean, we do have to kind of have our own moral compass. I mean, too literal is putting something in a kill jar, and I don't think it's always for the benefit of people. So yeah, so I guess good heart is a what a good heart is a big question, but but
Yeah.
that's anyway, just
Yeah.
popped in.
What do you think, Linda? Yeah, Linda.
A minute. I'm really confused at this point because Pirkei Avot, I mean, we're reading it now and we seem to be interpreting it at the level of the individual. How do I, as an individual Jew, go out into the world and behave in an ethical fashion?
Yeah.
But we live in collectivities, among them nations. To what extent is Pirkei Avot transferable to a collective level? And what do you do when you see, a contradiction between the values that you're supposed to be enacting in your own life and then perhaps collective behavior from your community, which
Yeah.
goes against those values?
Yeah, it's a good question. Listen, I think ultimately morality is always gonna, I don't know if I want to use the word morality, but I think ultimately we're called on to work, um, on our on our midot, on our qualities, right? We're called on to work on ourselves. Why? Because that's the only laboratory we have control over, right? That's the laboratory we have control over. Now, we are part of a collectivity, and there's no reason why we can't act on those, and no reason why we can't act on those values within the collectivity. And there's no reason why we can't try to inculcate those values in collectivity. I mean, by teaching and by example. Um, and but yeah, I mean, it very very often, the one of the things I've discovered uh, is that crowds are dumb. I don't know if that's a nice way to put it, but uh, I, it's the collective often falls to the lowest common denominator. That I think is a consistent finding. I don't know what to say about it. I don't have any brilliant insight about it. Um, but yeah, I think that we have a right and we have a right obligation to call on our community to have to reach the highest moral standards that we can, and that it falls short is the same way as us falling short. But that's what also, I mean, he says here, that message where he says that a person is good to have is a shachen tov, a good neighbor. I mean, part of it is living in communities and having friends, who are like-minded with you. I spoke about this yesterday, and I'm doing this thing every day, like this, you know,
Hmm.
this derech eretz thing I'm doing every day. Um, he was talking about, yoking animals together. He says, that we don't yoke a donkey with an ox because it's going to be unpleasant for both of them. They move at different paces and different strands.
Hmm.
And it's going to be unpleasant. And so sometimes with people, it's the same thing. Sometimes we have to be in communities and to be in touch with people who are like-minded so that we're moving in the same direction and we're moving at the same pace and we're not working against each other. And sometimes it works like that in community. If you're in a community where really you're working against swimming upstream all the time, then sometimes you have to find another community. I mean, that's not easy. I'm
Well,
not saying it's easy.
you just mentioned the term a good neighbor, and I want to broaden that. Or Pirkei Avot is a series of guidelines that we use within the Jewish community. But we live in a world of non-Jews, and we have neighbors both in the broader communities, but also beyond our borders. Who
Yeah.
are what is the standard of ethics that we are expected to exercise towards them? Why should I'm thinking of a certain conflict that's ongoing right now, and one of the things that has struck me is how little um, we have tried to be a good neighbor.
Yeah.
Like,
Well, if you're asking me, like if you're asking, as I always, my opinions are always my own opinions. My own opinion is that you don't get to turn on and off the highest standards of behavior, right? Who you are is who you are. So the idea that I can be, and I know people who within their community are very loving and kind. They would do anything for you. They're amazing. They're awesome. And and when it comes to people outside their community, they're completely hostile and would do nothing for them. And I, I don't understand how that works. It wouldn't work for me because I am basically whoever I am, wherever I am. I don't know how they manage that. You know, I, I don't really understand that because it doesn't work for me. So in my world, I have to be whoever I am, wherever I am. Okay, and whoever I'm with, I have to be. I'm forced to be a good neighbor because I want to be a decent person, and I don't know how to be a decent person here and not a decent person there. So
yeah, Well, I guess now I've backed myself into the probably the biggest intellectual problem I have with Judaism, and that's the split between a universalist approach and a particularist approach. And you subscribe to a universalist approach. Your values are your values. You bring them out into the world, and it doesn't matter to whom you are speaking or with whom you are working. They're your values. And I subscribe to that point of view. But I've noticed particularism is extremely strong within the community.
Yeah, sure it is.
And I'm trying to understand the historical reason for the strength of particularism. Is this the result of 800 years of living in a ghetto or what?
Well, I think that's a good start. I mean, I think because this is a longer. Let me hold off on this one, and maybe I'll talk about it a little bit more next time when I have a chance to kind of meditate on it a little bit. But I think you're right. I think it's a lot of it is historical. A lot of it is historical. I mean, a lot of it has to do with persecution, has to do with isolation, has to do with I'm always
It's
I'm always amazed, at because of isolation, how, and I'm in a Sephardi community, right? And my Sephardi friends often talk about, they talk about their neighbors in Morocco, or their neighbors in Iraq, or and it is, or Iran, and it's amazing the things that they thought about their neighbors. Like it's amazing the amount of ignorance they had about their neighbors. I've Iranian friends who thought that Iranian Muslims worshipped rocks, right? Because they put turba, they put a stone before they pray, they put a piece of clay, and they put their head on the piece of clay because really you're supposed to be praying on the ground, but it's uncomfortable. So you have a carpet, so you put the clay so that it has the deen, the quality of the ground. Like, so any case, we'll talk more about the particularism because it's a special analysis
if
of.
you're going to prepare, I just want to point out tell you what the flip side to that is in my eye, so that you can prepare for that as well, which is if the key point of morality is to be a good person, why bother to shake a lulav? Why bother to keep kosher? Why not just focus on being a loving neighbor to all around you?
Well, okay, so I have a good, yes, that's a good question. The Rambam answers it nicely, but okay, we'll try to answer that question. Maybe that'll be a special day. We'll do a special day on that, and I'll get myself into real trouble, and that'll be that. Okay, so um, is it any surprise to any of you that the very same guy who was called um, the overflowing spring is the very same guy who said a good heart? It seems to kind of fit, right? I don't know why it fits exactly, but it seems to fit, right? It's kind of like it gives you a sense of give you a sense of who he is, right? I mean, sort of
Sounds
like.
generous. Yes. Yeah.
Right. There is a sort of generosity there. There's a kind of, you know, he's sort of like it sounds like by saying, the good heart, what his teacher says, yes, that's a good answer because it's kind of inclusive of all, it's inclusive of all the others. That a person who cultivates this good heart is going to um is going to naturally seek having a good neighbor, is going to make good friends, is going to have a generous eye towards other people, and so that's it. We didn't make any progress today, but at least we tried. The next one is interesting because it seems we'll talk about it next time, But it's interesting because it seems completely superfluous. I see no reason why the next Mishnah is here. And so my job this week is to figure out why this next Mishnah is here, since it doesn't seem to be adding any new information whatsoever.
Love that. That's my favorite kind of topic.
Right.
Yeah.
So it's not adding any new
I
information.
love it. Yeah. Superfluous. Why? Miscellaneous. I love, yeah,
Why
anything.
is this here? Because, but, and Larry's going to tell us next time why this is here. I'm putting it all on Larry. Okay.
Unfortunately, I'm at the Hadar conference next Tuesday, so I'm not going to be
Oh,
here
see,
next week. Sorry.
he's copping out. He's copping out. Okay, I'm gonna have to come up with it on myself, but I'll figure something out. I hope everybody has a beautiful day. Bezrat Hashem, some of you will come back tomorrow for Duties of the Heart. Feel free to invite anybody you want. Friends, enemies, enemies of friends, friends of enemies, frenemies, if there are such things. Frenemies, that's a word. And family members, ex-family members, ex-spouses, anybody. Okay, have a beautiful day.
Thank you so much. Bye.
Thank you.